For me, weaving sort of encapsulated everything that I wanted out of a creative outlet. From the design process, you're working with colour. I'm quite a textural person, I'm drawn to texture, so getting to select yarns that are highly textural versus something that's quite sort of flat is quite interesting to get that sort of varied surface patterns. I knew that I wanted to sort of summarise my sort of summer experience, and a lot of it has been driving, and on my way here a lot of the time I was driving past fields full of foxgloves, and like the colours were just really attractive to me, and I knew that I wanted to do something with them. So when it came to deciding a warp for this, I basically collated different types of yarns that I had. I was looking online at some dead stock websites, and I basically started building the colour palette. I then sort of started noting down sort of what I wanted per inch, and then filling in the gaps with a bit of colouring pen just to sort of determine what stripe was going to go where and what sort of colour block. And then that all came down to then doing some yarn wraps and sort of winding different colour patterns and stripes, because I knew that I wanted a quite dynamic sort of warp. And then it came to then actually deciding on the measurements, the width, the length that I wanted, the sort of surface texture that was going to come from it, and then that's how it started coming together and how individual yarns then were then wound around the warping mill. The whole sort of winding process is very therapeutic, and you're sort of really working with the fibre, and each individual thread you're sort of really connecting with what you're eventually going to weave. But then sometimes you can get quite lost in it, and when it comes to counting and making sure that you've got the correct number of threads, you've got to sort of be mindful that you're still counting and concentrating, but then also just letting the process happen and winding around. All the preliminary stuff is in the book, so all the measurements that I need, how many total threads that there are, the sort of ends per inch, and how many ends per that inch that I'm working with, and I've got to count and remember. So I essentially will grab the yarn that I'm doing, and each individual thread will get wound round this warping mill. So I was working with 8 meters, so there's about 8 meters going down, and then I'd repeat the process going back up, making sure that I was keeping my cross sticks, which is crucial down the line for sort of when it comes to setting up the loom. I need to know what order I've wound it in, and the cross sticks basically retain that order that was wound on the loom. And then in terms of the winding side of things, every half inch I'm checking in with myself, making sure that the correct number of threads are in that half inch, and then I'm marking it with a bundle. I then sort of really carefully make sure all my ends are tied on. Then I sort of almost in a plait-like way make sure it's all neatly taken off, and then I pass it onto the loom then and put it on the back beam. And then once it's on the back beam, I then go back to the bundles that I created earlier, so the half-inch bundles, and I use my raddle, which is almost, it looks like a plank of wood with nails in it, and I use that to sort of create the width of the cloth that I'd already predetermined. So for this one it was 20 inches. So the bundles that I'd marked per half inch I then spread across those half inch sections, ready to be wound on the back beam then. I'd say the only challenge that sort of arises is if you get too lost in it and you lose where you are and you've got to go back and count how many threads you've done. But in terms of just ensuring that the cross sticks are in place, so you'll notice that there's almost like a cross-like shape at the top and the bottom. So retaining that, because that's really crucial to the order of things. So as long as I've got the cross, everything's good and straightforward. So from that point, it's quite nice that it's like the nice part before the process actually gets a bit trickier. Then is the quite nice part that I'm undoing the plait slowly and winding it around the back beam. And for this one it was quite a process, because you've got to comb out the yarn to make sure that it's all sort of in order, all flat, ready that when it's packed into its sort of roll, it's all sort of in order and correct. So as I'm rolling it around, I'm inserting newspaper just to keep the threads separated, because without the newspaper they'd all be stuck together and it would be quite a nightmare unravelling it. So it just keeps the process smooth when I'm winding forward. But because I had the sticky mohair that I chose, it was quite sort of time consuming to make sure that I was combing it correctly so that when I got down to the bottom, when I was inserting my cross sticks, that all the yarns were still in order and not tangled. So I was making sure along the way that I was untangling as I went. So the next process was threading, and then I knew that in terms of this loom, it's a 4-shaft loom, so it was going to be a straight draft, which is utilising shafts 1 to 4. The shafts basically dictate the surface pattern. So in terms of this loom, if I was working with a plain weave, I'm using shafts 1 and 3 to lift half of the threads, and then I'm alternating with shafts 2 and 4 to then create the second half of the lifting, and that will basically alternate to create like a plain weave pattern, which is the base of the cloth then. It's quite therapeutic in the way that you're grabbing the threads again and you're interacting with the individual threads. 250 threads this one was made up out of. This is the exciting part because this is when the cloth sort of starts to form. It's quite a repetitive process, and there only being 4 shafts, it's quite nice because you're only going up 4 and coming back down 4. So it's quite quick in terms of that side. So when it gets to the end, you're sort of fingers crossing that you haven't missed anything. Although if you have been carefully checking along the way, you know you're quietly confident. You can always sort of make adjustments along the way. As many visitors will see, I've got a comb on the back which I've wound a thread that snapped around. So it's just making sure that all the threads are thing, but there is sort of solutions if a problem arises. So once all the threads have been threaded, the next part is reeding them. So the ends per inch that I was talking about earlier is dictated by the reed. So this reed in particular was I think it was a 12 dent reed, meaning that that dictates how many threads you're pulling through. So using my 20 inches, I was sort of marking out where that would sit on the reed. And then essentially the reed helps to separate the yarns, but also it's attached to the beater. So once your shafts have been lifted, it's helping it split. And then once you beat down, that's helping you form the cloth then. The reeding process is quite nice because you haven't got to keep count necessarily anymore. You're just sort of selecting the threads and you're so close to the end that you just want to get it done. So it's quite nice that, especially with the 2 threads per dent, you're sort of threading it through quite quickly. So once everything's been reeded, everything's been put through, you're then sort of sectioning it into about sort of inch bundles that you're then going to use to tie onto the front beam. So this is when you're really sort of thinking about bringing all your threads together. You're really thinking about creating the warp, you're tying it on and creating the tension. So for this, you're working from the outside in, and I'm taking my inch sort of sections, I'm tying it on the front beam, securing it all in place, and once all of the threads have been attached, I'm then going to go back over them all and even out the tension, so the tension is uniform across the board, and then the cloth can be ready to weave then. This is the first time that you're truly seeing the warp as it's going to be ready for you to weave. So it's like the most exciting part, because all that hard work and like time consuming processes that you've gone through, and like if any issues have come up that you've sort of sorted through and combed through, it's quite nice to know that after all of that, this sort of finished warp that you've got in front of you is exactly how you've envisioned it. And it's really exciting that even though you haven't put any weft in and you haven't started weaving it, just going from that piece of paper in the book, from a little pen line that I did, or a little pink line that I knew I wanted that to be a group of pink, it's just quite nice to sort of finally see it come to life. Essentially, when you're actually starting to weave, I was using the foot pedals to sort of dictate what shafts that I'd threaded up earlier. So I was doing a plain weave structure, meaning I was using one pedal to lift shafts 1 and 3, and then the next pedal to do 2 and 4. So essentially by doing this, by pressing the pedal down and lifting, you're creating almost a shed that the shuttle will pass through. So for me, this shed was quite tricky because it was wanting to stick together after being compacted for so long. So I've got to intervene, but as long as there's a clear path for the shuttle to go through, The weaving process then is very straightforward, and it's just passing the shuttle back and forth, alternating those shafts, and then the colour starts to form by, I've got sort of a collection of yarns around me that I sort of look at, and I remember those initial foxglove fields that I was driving past, and I'm just sort of, at the moment, spontaneously picking out the colours that appeal to me, doing the sort of sections that this is working really well, what can I insert to sort of contrast that, and just really sort of varying it up and creating a pattern, whether that be a check or a repeat pattern. I'm sort of experimenting and playing with it all and seeing where it will take me. There is no true difference between the sort of more modern looms and these looms. Of course, there's a bit more hand intervention and there's a lot more of me getting put into it, but it's quite nice to sort of really go back to the basics in terms of these looms. For me, it was quite nice to come in here and sort of reconnect with weaving from a more basic standpoint and really just sort of enjoy the process more, really sort of notice the intricate details that I hadn't really noticed before either, and just sort of let the processes guide me. And then once the sort of weaver's ready to weave, it was sort of letting the environment and sort of daily journeys past these foxglove fields sort of inspire the process. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to seeing what sort of cloth comes out of it in the end. It's amazing how the different structures change how it feels as well.